This, for people who don't know you, how would you describe yourself as a person? What's your character? What's your personality?
I'm extremely entrepreneurial. I am really driven by a set of values that have come out of a life in the margins, human rights and social justice, that we have to have a society that works to include everybody. But I'm really different than most people who might see themselves, as liberals, in the sense that I'm incredibly entrepreneurial, both in the idea of, where I'm much more interested in reducing the tax burden to build the tax base. I'm really interested in how the tax system facilitates capital investment, very entrepreneurial stuff. And personally, like when I was a city councillor, we didn't have any federal or provincial money or municipal money for housing. So I and a bunch of folks got on our bicycles and we cycled to Atlanta, Georgia, over 3,000 kilometers in 2 weeks, and we raised a whole bunch of money for affordable housing. When I got elected as the MPP in Toronto Centre, I immediately changed the way decision making was made. I called all the city councillors in and the school trustees. We started working together. We convened everyone in our neighborhood, and we set up neighborhood councils that set neighborhood priorities. And so I really work with residents in a very grassroots way, where it's not me coming up with the ideas. It's the people who live in Cabbagetown or St. Jamestown or Rosedale. And if you go to the website, torontocenterplan.org, you'll see every single neighborhood residents are involved in determining their own future, sort of beyond the ballot box democracy, where people do more than vote and pay taxes. They actually work with their MPPs and their city councillors to identify and solve problems. So very entrepreneurial, very consensus-oriented in the way I do politics, but very driven leadership. Once we decide on something, I fight like heck for it.
But I'm also interested in Glen Murray, the person, and how these things manifest itself in your character. So what are you like as a human being?
Well, I don't know. It's hard to describe yourself. I love theater. I have a great sense of humor, I think. I love to laugh. The thing that probably formed my life more than anything else was a cherishing of life itself, because for me, at a very young age, when the AIDS epidemic hit, it probably changed my character more than anything else. I'm not sure I would be the person today, or had I even gone into politics, if I hadn't, on my 30th birthday, gone to the 42nd funeral for a friend of mine who died of AIDS. So while my father was struggling and dying of cancer through my 20s, all my friends who were my own age, who were in the middle of medical degrees, starting their own businesses, were getting sick with a virus we didn't even have a name for at the time, and dying. And I realized the fragility of human life. I also realized how hard it is for families when they face a crisis, because the hardest job I ever had in my life was going with young men who were in their 22 or 23, sitting in their living room because they didn't know how to talk to their parents, and saying, look, your son's gay and he's got AIDS and he probably won't live through the summer, and seeing all kinds of reactions to that. Parents who just poured love on their kid, were devastated. Hard to describe how a father can look at his son and say, and disown them, and then have to leave with that son, with often a friend or often someone who, because I set up an AIDS clinic and this is where I was doing the work. So I was often there in that kind of professional capacity and personal capacity, and then having to pack this young man up, carry him often because he was so sick, to the back of a car, and find a new place for him to live. And that was a hard time, but it really defined my character. In being able to make tough decisions. Nothing I've ever faced as mayor of a city, bootstrapping my own business, being a shop steward in a union, heading up a not-for-profit, having a life through 3 provinces and doing all kinds of things. Nothing has been more difficult, or have I ever had to face a more difficult situation than helping people close out their lives at an incredibly early age, and helping families work through that horribly difficult experience.
Take me back further. Tell me about your upbringing, growing up, family life growing up.
Well, my dad, I always sort of joke that when I watch Mad Men, minus the excess alcohol consumption, those guys were like my dad. My dad was an incredibly honest guy, extraordinary entrepreneur. I think that entrepreneurial spirit I got from my father. He always bootstrapped his own businesses. He created 3 companies. He built the largest overnight freightway company between Montreal and Toronto from nothing. He was an incredibly honest guy. I used to go and do. He was a manufacturer's agent and represented all kinds of companies. And I would go into stores, and he would go in with them. And I was always amazed that he'd walk into a store, and the store owner or the general manager or buyer would say, Ron, whatever you think we need, put it on the shelf. I mean, they would get blank order forms. And that was my father's character, that he was so trusted in his business that he never negotiated that. He would never give people more product than what they want. And I was always amazed at his personal integrity, and often even when he lost money, because he was so honest with people, over the longer term, really carried him forward, because he had something that very few people have, which is an incredible sense of public trust that comes from personal integrity. I think I've spent my whole life trying to emulate that. It was when I worked in healthcare, that was particularly important, because you're handling very, very personal information about people. People who are very poor, people who are very sick. You become very protective of that. So that was interesting. My mom valued public service. She volunteered for everything. She always said to me, we're pretty privileged to be in this country. My grandmother came from Ukraine, arrived in Hamilton in 1908. Didn't speak a word of English, suffered really, raised 7 kids in a 2-bedroom cold water flat. I mean, I just can't imagine that her very best days looked anything, or that my worst days were a lot better than those. So my mother always had that idea that she made it to the middle class. She was stable, and she taught me public service. I mean, we were raised with the idea of you want for others what you want for yourself. You live for hope. You don't live for fear, and you try to have the courage of your grandparents. I mean, she always tell me, grandmother 18, didn't speak a word of English. There was no CBC. There was no CNN. There was no cell phones. And she came halfway around the world to a country in which the elders in her village said was so frozen you couldn't grow food, and she had no way to know differently. So that my mother always is. She lives in Toronto. She's an amazing woman, very courageous, and I've always tried to emulate that kind of courage that my parents taught me as well.
Okay. And as an adult, your family life, you have a partner?
I have a partner, Rick. He's an amazing, again, it's me in public service. He's served in Canadian Armed Forces, a very courageous soldier, and in the Navy. Incredible record of public service. I think as a result of what he saw, he came back and did a nursing degree. He's a neurosurgical nurse, a very brilliant one at Toronto Western Hospital. It's a great career there. My son Michael, you've heard me talk about, he's the person why I believe that health and social services are so important. Michael grew up, had fetal alcohol syndrome, went through horrible experiences as a child, abuse and difficulties. And when I met him when he was 11, when I was doing street outreach work, working with street-involved youth, eventually fostered him, adopted him as my son later in life. He is an amazingly courageous guy who lives in Calgary, has gotten into the trades, got married. I have a grandson. His wife passed away at a very young age of cancer, so that was a real tragedy. He is another person that inspires me, because when I think about the worst things in my childhood, don't compare to the kind of courage he had to get through to get off the street, to get off drugs, to survive the physical and mental health challenges he had. And the importance of mental health services to me is so important, because when I was a foster parent taking care of kids with some severe mental health challenges, the only way they got services if we locked them up, almost like in a very polite jail, and they couldn't get those services when they were with families. So I've been a lot of when you hear me talking about community-based care, not-for-profit-based care for young people, it's because I really believe that connection between community service and people dedicated to community services and not-for-profits and civil society groups and parents and families and foster parents are really a different dynamic than either government institutional care or some of the things when people say you can save money by cutting this stuff. I think you just destroy families. So a lot of what my politics have translated from my own life experience.
And that leads into the next question, which is why did you make that personal decision to jump into politics the first time? Why?
Well, I was running a successful business with some friends. I saw neighborhoods deteriorating. I saw...
This is in Winnipeg, right?
Yeah, this is Winnipeg, but it probably started... And I reflected back to my youth, and I said, so, what can I do to change this? I remember as a kid growing up in Montreal, my mother reminds me of this all the time. We used to read the newspaper, starting when I was about 6 or 7 years old, over her shoulder, which used to drive her crazy. And we used to talk about it. But I remembered, when I was very young, like before I was even like 10 years old, discovering John Diefenbaker, who I'm a huge fan of. I mean, he got the vote for First Nations people. He got a real, we think about Pierre Trudeau and human rights, but it was actually John Diefenbaker who got our first human rights code in Canada. And he inspired me. And then Lester Pearson, one of the first television I remember was when he established the Peace Corps and put the Canadian forces between the French and the British and the Middle East. And I thought, the Blue Berets, this was so, this is amazing. Like look what this guy can do. And then Tommy Douglas in Medicare and pensions, and Stanley Knowles, and some of those folks did amazing stuff. And I thought, how else can you make a difference than going into public service? What a more noble calling than public service. And so when all of this stuff was going on, and then the AIDS epidemic hit. And I was looking at I lived in Ontario, I lived in Ottawa for 7 years, and I moved to Toronto, and then I moved to Winnipeg, and then back to Toronto. All of that moving around, I saw a lot of different communities. But when I was in Winnipeg, it was a really poor city and a very forgotten place. And I thought, well, maybe I should run for city council. Maybe I can make a difference. Maybe on a little scale, I can try to emulate the kinds of leadership that I saw in public service I saw. And that's how really I got into it, because I thought it was the best way to try and fix problems in my neighborhood I didn't see getting fixed.
Okay. I know you probably don't have a lot of spare time, but when you have spare time, what do you like to do?
Cycle. I cycle to raise money for housing. I cycle to Atlanta and at Kansas City, which for a middle-aged guy is kind of challenging. I like to do things that are physically on the edge. You wouldn't know by my buff physique, but I spend a lot of time doing long-distance marathon cycling. And I love the camaraderie of that. I do Friends for Life, raising money for AIDS. I do Habitat for Humanity, raising money for affordable housing. I love to see the country. I love cycling because I meet people. It just brings you not just into the main streets of communities, but into the heart of the community where you see people and you connect with other people who are that. When I cycle through Brockville or Cornwall or those communities in the summer, you get to know them in a different way. And you meet extraordinary people, because a lot of small Ontario rural communities, people know each other, and it's almost like barn building. Everyone collaborates. So I love that kind of experience. I love films, I love theater, and I love to read. And I have saved two things for my old age. I tried to learn how to play saxophone when I was younger. My embouchure is terrible, if anyone knows what that is, and I'm saving that for my old age. I want to become a sax player at one point in my life, and I used to paint a lot. I like oil painting. I love visual arts, so I used to do that. And when I retire from politics, I want to be a painter and a saxophone player. Given that we have no pensions, I sort of figured that playing sax on street corners might be my best retirement plan.